Kokkvöld. Jeg skal vekna rithøvundan som fyrskipar av som tiltaksjonen. Biotekna var hjertelig velkommen til hese neste 45 minutter. Jeg heter Urt Johannesen og har finnet til ære at skifte år vid rithøvundan Tim Ecott om hans bok The Land of Maybe, a Faroe Islands Year, som kom ut Fyrr i år. Jeg er ferdig å sette til noen spørninger og Bodam for å lese 2 brot ur Bókin av Føroyum som Johan Ludvig Laxafoss har twitt. Om tøyen løyvet du, så får vi da vite om onker kanskje her ute i salen noen hever onker spørning til Tim. And now we switch over to English. And to you, Tim Ecott, with us from London, a warm welcome.
God close.
And welcome to any other people who might have joined us on the online streaming service. I don't know if you see them, Tim, but there are some friendly faces here, and I'm sure you know them, most of them. First of all, congratulations on your book, which I've had the pleasure of reading a couple of times now. Tim, you're born in Ireland and have lived and worked in many different places around the world, also in your capacity as a former BBC World Service correspondent. You write documentaries for radio and screen, and this new book, The Land of Maybe, is your 5th publication. They all draw heavily on your fondness for nature and the natural world. Just so we are all on the same page, before we begin, I will give a short account of the book. It's published in April this year by the London-based publisher Short Books, illustrated by your wife Jessica Ecott. There are 12 chapters in the book, and it follows the natural cycle of the year. In each chapter, you travel to a new island where you meet local people, mostly men, and join them for haymaking, or when they go hunting for birds' eggs, hair, gather sheep, herd pilot whales, etc. You portray in great detail the landscapes, the people, our culture, legends and stories, our traditions. In short, you portray our way of life on these 18 islands, which, it says, maintains a deep connection to the past. You traveled to the Faroe Islands for the first time about 10 years ago. In the beginning of the book, you write about the long journey, trying to land 3 times, but due to fog, the flight is reverted to Iceland. On page 13, you write, and I quote, "Repeated visits to the islands mean leaving my wife Jessica and her children behind in England. It's possible I'm searching for something that only islands seem to offer. I deny it, although Jessica claims that men find islands appealing because they hold the promise of private kingdoms, imaginary holdfasts to escape from problems we cannot face at home. What is this something that only islands seem to offer? And I could maybe add, what is that something that the Faroe Islands offer since you come back again and again?"
Well, thank you, Erd. Yes, I grew up on an island, Ireland, which is a fairly big island compared to the Faroe Islands, of course. But I spent a lot of my younger years as a journalist reporting from the Indian Ocean islands, places like the Seychelles, Madagascar, the Comoro Islands, other islands around Mozambique. And I've always been fascinated by them, and my activity as a scuba diver and marine conservationist took me to a lot of other, mainly tropical islands. And I did have this dream once upon a time of living on a small island, which I managed to make come true. And I realized fairly quickly that living in a community on a small island brings its own challenges. So when I say I do dream of escape on an island, I don't say that in a immature or hasty way. But I think I felt very at home very quickly in the Faroe Islands. And that was partly to do with the island location, but it was also partly to do with the people whom I met there.
When did you decide to write a book about the Faroe Islands, and did you have a clear vision right away of what kind of book you wanted to write?
No, I never know exactly what my books are going to be about, even when I'm starting to write them. But I think I liked the idea of a book about Faroe Islands pretty early on, probably on my second or third visit. By that time, I had started to meet more Faroese people, and although I was initially very excited by the landscape and the natural surroundings, it was the Faroese people and the deep, very rich history of Faroe Islands that began to interest me more. And I realized that it was a place that, although very sophisticated in many ways, was also relatively unknown to many people outside the islands.
I must say that I really enjoyed reading your book. Not only is the language beautiful, rich in details, poetic, full of colors, and as a reader I travel with you and I see and sense everything. But also as a native Faroese person, I feel as if I'm seeing and experiencing many things for the first time. You have great access to niche information that even I as a native might be oblivious to. So I've learned a bit or two, which is quite remarkable for someone who comes from the outside looking in. Obviously, you've done some great research. The reference list in your book is long and impressive. Can you tell us a bit about the whole process and what it takes to be able to write in such great detail?
I think you need, first of all, to be very interested in the subject matter. I spent quite a long time at university as an academic, so I think the research part of the writing process I always find interesting. And I probably spend at least 6 months purely doing research, including library research and looking for primary historical information before I start to feel comfortable enough with any topic before I actually begin writing the kind of words that will eventually appear in the finished book. But most of the books I've written have relied very much on personal contact with people and with getting under the skin of a place or a topic, even if it's a topic that I know is quite complicated. I think one of the things you notice as a reader is whether a writer is genuinely interested in a place or a topic, or whether they have looked at this topic just with the idea of writing a book about it. And I think you can tell there's a degree of genuine connection there, I think. And because, as you say, you need to be well-informed, but you need to have there has to be a heart and a soul to the book. There has to be a degree of passion. So when I'm writing about a topic, I tend to immerse myself in it very thoroughly. And I was very lucky with the assistance of my journalist career and being able to write a lot of travel stories, particularly about Faroe Islands, to return many times to build up that network of local connections before I felt I was at least in a position to say that I understood the place on a deeper level than perhaps a casual visitor would.
And the research, I mean, there are lots of books that I have never heard of. How did you get hold of the material?
Well, I'm very lucky that I have a fellowship at the moment at Oxford University, and the Bodleian Library, which is the university library, is one of the biggest libraries in the world, and even books written in Faroese can be tracked down through that library and found. I found a lot of books through Faroese friends. I bought books secondhand. I got friends to translate passages if I was very unsure about the exact meaning. So it's a gradual process, and it takes time. I suppose that the good thing about Faroe Islands is that compared to some other places, the number of books written about Faroe Islands is relatively small. So getting hold of the key texts might not have been necessarily easy, but at least I had a sort of hit list of books that I felt I needed to check before I started writing my own book.
between every chapter you have a little parallel story about a pair of ravens and their nest in a gorge on the island of Voar. Could you please maybe read the small passage on page 21 in English, and then we will have our fellow friend, director and artist Buedam, read the same passage in Faroese afterwards.
Yes, as you say, there's a lot of natural history in the book. And of course, Faroese people don't need me to tell you how interesting your bird life is. And I think there was something particular about the ravens which caught my imagination, because they were a bird I had been familiar with in Northern Ireland, where my grandparents lived and where I lived and went to school. So yes, in between each historical and cultural chapter, there are these little vignettes, and I'll read now. So this is on Voar in the early spring. There are ravens in the gorge. They've built their nest in a wall that the rain makes as shiny as their own beaks. This pile of sticks and twigs, moss and feathers, rope ends, clumps of wool and other nameless scraps has been woven into an untidy ball. Dry and pale like old bleached bones, it forms a loose, tottering thing, wedged tight against the back wall of that miniature cave. The nest sits in an uneven, sloping niche, just a metre deep and about twice as wide. But this is a safe house, with enough of an overhang to keep off the rain, as well as the almost constant slick of moisture that runs down from the top of the cliff, forming a dripping veil between the nest and the outside world. The fall from the niche is 25 metres to where sunless seawater slaps and sucks against the base of the rock face. The water laps with a tinkling echo, and sometimes a northeasterly wind scrapes across the walls of the ravine in a hard whistle. Down in the gorge, the air is chilled by rock which sees no sun, winter or summer. Northwest of the raven's nest, the sound glows pink in the longest summer evenings as the barely setting orb tracks across the narrows, softening the shape of the hills on either side of the water. Even then, the cleft stays unlit, shaded by the folding land. The landowner thinks it's funny, or at least perplexing, that I return to the nest most days, and sometimes more than once a day, to check on the chicks. He knows how often I go because it's his pasture, and out of respect I always call to ask him if I can visit. In Faroes, unlike many parts of Scandinavia, there is no legal right to roam on private land. For me, going to see the nest site is a privilege. It feels like a sacred spot for me, and the birds convey magic too. Perhaps this gorge is what the Celts call a thin place, where the earthly world and the afterlife are within touching distance of one another. The raven spirit captures something of the true north.
Thank you. Bue?
Hello. Hey. Congratulations, Tim, on the book.
Thank you, Bua. Nice to see you.
You too. You're very big. You look good. Ja. Voar tullja vare. Her raunar ui gjønne. Der hava reirast ui regnvadon berge som bjarst skytjande eins og tarra egna nev. Hesen dungeon av pinnon og greinun, mosa og fjagrun, tåendun, totton av ull og øron ånevndun petton voven saman til eina åroddelige kuttlo. Uppturska og bleik som gåmul kvittna bein skapar hon eina leisa vibbrekna eind, skåra inn av botten og hese grunn og hålo. Reire sitter av en skranande ras, best 1 meter djup og omlai tverfyr så brei. Men det et trygt heim. Vi nok av tejo at halda regne og støvum sevjolekum fra bergtråmene bostere. Som et vått skuile mellom reire og heimen utanfyr. Fattelig av rasene 25 meter nyer til her solar leisa havet slær, og sujur mot I hellene vi hemars foten. Vattnet skvattlar vi glintande atterljóe, og onketøy frøyser landeringsvinderen herliga tvørser sujenar av gjønne. Nere I gjønne kølna luften av gråte, og I aldren ser solena kvarstja vetre etla somre. Og I en utnering fra raunareiren gleggvar fjøreren, ljósareier, og I vester skinen de langst og sommerkvaldene, ta stokkota solsetre fer kvinande tvørster sunde, og mykjer, hedjar og skør av bavon, sujon av sundenon. Eisne ta stende djekven, myrsk og I skugganon av faltande lendenon. Bønden heldet det være stuttlet, etla gjødlom for undrunarverst, at det nastan kvønde fer I atte til reire. Og ankra det flere for dagen for at hitja til pisenar. Han veit hvordan ofte tog vi viring fire at etter hansare heie ringi alt og spyr løyvi av vidja. Vi Føroyum ikke løfta færa en tur I privat lente, så det I øron skandinavisk London. At færa og hitja til reire tidsis mer tog som en framutjarater. Djekven kjennest som et heilagt sted fyrir meg, og foklaner og dreande en så gander. Kanska djekven en så det som keltane kallar av et middelom sted. Her den gjerlige og den andalige heimeren nær nærsta vi kvann annan. Fyrir meg og raunar sanna og imenden av utenåret.
Tack. Thank you very much. You seem to be to get quite emotionally attached to the ravens and the three chicks, and you even refer to them as your ravens. How did this little story come about, and when did you decide to include it in the book? And what is it? You mentioned it a bit before, but what is it about ravens that fascinates you?
Well, ravens, as you know, are very large in Nordic literature, and indeed not just Nordic literature, but in many First Peoples, for example, in North America and Canada, the raven has a very strong symbolic presence. And I think because I knew them as a child on the mountains behind my grandparents' house, which, if you were to look at them, you would say you were in Faroe Islands. They are old granite mountains and basalt, and they have very few trees, certainly not up on the top. And they look very, very like the Faroe Islands, the mountains of Mourne. And geologically, that part of Ireland is exactly the same as Faroe Islands, and a small part of western or eastern Iceland, I should say. So they were birds that to me linked that Irish and Faroese connection for me. And they were very powerful symbols, but they were also interesting birds. And I was out in this part of Boar with one of my Faroese friends one day looking for a missing sheep, which we thought had fallen off a cliff and was injured. We didn't find the sheep, but on the way home, he said, there is usually a raven nesting in this gorge, in this jeg. Shall we go and look? And I said, yes. And I realized that what was very unusual about this gorge was that you could be on the land at the top of the jeg and look down into the raven's nest. And ravens normally in the UK certainly always nest up very high, and it's very hard to find somewhere that you can really watch them easily without climbing or being a mountaineer. And this was a very beautiful spot, but it was also a spot where I could look into the nest without disturbing the birds. And I returned there frequently before they had eggs, and then when the eggs were hatched. And as I say, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. Once I even slept there above the jeg one early summer's night, so that I could watch the ravens first thing in the morning. And they're nervous birds, as you know. But I think because I was very careful to always crawl up to the edge of the jeg and lie there for several hours at a time without making too much noise or moving about too much, then the parents would even return to the nest while I was there. So I had a very privileged spot. And I didn't know that the ravens would feature in my book at all. I wanted to write about them in the same way as I wrote about eftir or the gannets or many of the other species in Faroe Islands. But I didn't want it to be just one little story because I felt they symbolized a lot about my experience of being outside in the natural surroundings of the island. And it just came to me one day that I could actually extend this descriptive passage and use it to punctuate the other chapters. So it was never part of a big plan. It just came to me in the process of the writing. But people seem to enjoy it. And I know that Faroese people, like many farming communities, are often a little bit suspicious of ravens. And I did become very protective of the birds, and I used to get very anxious if I went away for a few days to another island. And I would worry that somebody would disturb them or even shoot them while I was away. But the 3 chicks did hatch and they did fledge. So I like to think of them when I'm stuck here in England, unable to visit Faroe Islands, that somewhere these 3 chicks, and hopefully the parents too, are still flying around in the far north.
That's very nice picture. What I particularly enjoy in the book are the small glimpses that we get into your own life. As a young boy growing up in Ireland, the visits to your grandparents, although these passages also trigger my own inquisitiveness. For instance, about your granny and mother, whom you say shared a common desperation to get away from Ireland. These glimpses resonate with me because here you are not only observing and describing, but you sort of invest some personal emotion into the story and somehow give a bit of yourself to us as a reader. Is that a deliberate literary tool, or are there similarities between Ireland and the Faroe Islands that trigger the reminiscence? You even mentioned directly the link between Ireland, the Faroes, and the Irishness in the landscape.
I think it's both of those things. I think it's a literary tool only in the sense that a book is, I think, more successful if people believe that the writer cares about the subject. And in order to care about the writer, you need to know a little bit about them. And there are many travel books, particularly where the author pretends to be going on some kind of a personal journey. I've always resisted manufacturing some kind of journey or quest. But in the case of this book with Faroe Islands, I didn't need to pretend. For me, it was a very journey-like quest, or a quest which connected my childhood and a lot of my family memories with the landscape. And the rain and the so-called bad weather that you experience in Faroe Islands, for me, were not a negative. They were a very strong emotional connection to that early childhood in the mountains in Ireland. And as you say, I mentioned the fact that my mother and my grandmother spent all of their lives complaining about the weather in Ireland and saying that they wanted to leave, they wanted to go somewhere warmer and sunny. And they had both married British Army soldiers, so they had lived in India, in Malaysia, in Egypt, in these exotic places, and seen a different kind of life. And I think it made them very discontented with the small local scale of life in Ireland. And it took me a long time to confess, I suppose, to my mother that I enjoyed being up in the mountains in the rain. But when I told her that, I knew it was in a way being disloyal to her, because she hated it so much and she dreamt of escaping, and she wanted me to go and live somewhere tropical, which of course I ended up doing. And the island that I ran away to when my daughter was a baby was in the Seychelles. So a very big contrast to the island experience in Faroe Islands. But I think part of my maturity, and I think everyone's aging process, is that you start to become more tolerant of all kinds of things. But for me, the rain and the wind and the greenness and the surroundings of the mountains and all that water, they were very comforting. And that's why I responded to Faroe Islands, I think, on an emotional level, very strongly. And that Irish Faroese connection, as you know, goes back to probably the 4th or 5th or 6th century, when we know that probably the first people to try and stay in the islands were these Irish monks, who of course were running away from the world as well.
Yeah. You meet a lot of people, and for each place and each island you visit, there seems to be at least one person which becomes an authority for the story. How did you get in contact with these people in the first place, and how did you gain their trust in such a way that they actually play a significant role in the story? I should perhaps add that Faroese people often see themselves as being quite shy and reserved, especially if a foreign language is involved. But you seem to have a canny knack of getting under their skin.
Well, again, I think that a book is only successful with readers if it allows them to connect with the people in that story. I suppose jeg vil feien takke Atlum Winum Forreska Vinum for hjelpene I sambandet vi bøkene. Uten tikkere velvilt heitið ikke bare til.
Thank you.
But I suppose on each island, yes, there was usually a key character. But I think that's what human beings are interested in, is other people. We have green mountains in England and Ireland and Scotland. We have waterfalls and we have the Atlantic Ocean. Those things you're either interested in or you're not. But of course, most people want to know about Faroese people I've met. They want to know, why are they different? Are they different? What kind of traditions do they practice? Whether it's what they eat or what they wear or when they get married or what do they call their children? You know, these are it's the human details which bring people together. And I think a book which is only about landscape or nature, it is a different thing. It's more like a catalogue. But for me, the deepest connection with Faroe Islands has come through that very deep privilege that Faroese people have given me by allowing me to go into their homes, go out collecting sheep, eat, have Hester for Sunday lunch, you know, whatever it is. And those relationships, yes, I wanted to make them in order to understand the place, but they are friendships that I think will endure, and I fully hope to keep returning to Faroe Islands for as long as I can, because it is now the Faroese friends I have that I feel the deep connection with. I will, of course, always walk in the mountains and travel to other islands, but actually I have so many Faroese friends now who I miss deeply in this current situation. And thank goodness for Facebook Messenger, which is another thing I learned in Faroe Islands, because we don't use it so much in England, but I'm able to talk to people regularly and exchange messages and see photographs. So I keep up those connections.
You're a great naturalist and have a great fondness for birds, for sea mammals, for animals in general. In the very beginning of the book, when you're on Mykonos, you're handed a gannet and asked to kill it. On page 10 you write, and I quote, "Apart from being unsure of whether it's the right thing to do, I'm nervous of getting it wrong. I'm also conscious that Johannes is doing me an honor. I fear the embarrassment of appearing feeble and unmanly, but I'm equally worried I will muck it up." You're several times in the book emotionally challenged when faced with the hunting and the killing of animals. On page 140 you write, "Killing something for food seems justifiable, but if I am unlikely to eat it, then I balk." How did you cope with these challenges, and what drove you to continue to put yourself into these challenges?
Well, one of the things which interested me about Faroe Islands when I first visited was that many of the traditions to do with the land and farming and hunting were things which have largely, not completely, but largely died out in much of the rest of Western Europe. But one of the things that struck me very strongly was that people in Faroe Islands could manage to be very modern, very well-traveled, sophisticated people on one hand, but still expect to go out into the afjak in the autumn and catch sheep and slaughter them and butcher them and process the meat themselves. And that was, of course, not completely unknown to me, but it was the widespread nature of how everybody, whether they were a doctor or a hotel manager or a fisherman, come autumn, it was time to go and collect the sheep. And that deep, enduring connection with what you might call tradition or old-fashioned habits that was so common in society struck me as something that needed to be recorded. And so I wanted to take part in those processes as much as I could if people would let me, because I felt it would be dishonest to describe those things unless I had tried to do them myself. So again, as a writer, I feel you convey a much better and deeper impression of a place if you've immersed yourself in it. And I don't think I was too bad at doing those things, but many of them were new to me, and I was always the slightly hapless Onglendinga who couldn't be trusted with a big knife. But I think the fact that I was willing to try to do some of these things and learn also allowed me to forge a stronger connection with some of my Faroese friends, and I was very grateful for that opportunity.
Did you feel more manly?
I think there's something in all little boys. There's a fascination with knives and killing things, and we tend to bury that perhaps in English society. But yes, I think there is, in some ways, a degree of ease in Faroese culture with masculinity, which certainly in England people are less comfortable with now.
The chapter about the whale drive, chapter 7, it might be considered as the elephant in the room. Quite frankly, I dreaded this chapter, and as I was approaching the chapter, I was getting nervous. I'd met you a couple of times before, but we never had any discussions about the pilot whale hunt. With my past experience in the National Tourist Board, I had met quite a few travel writers, especially from the UK, who often came here with that hidden agenda. But I must say, I was relieved, once I'd read it. And the reason is that you're very honest and you put yourself in a context so that we understand where your viewpoints and attitudes come from. I mean, you've dived with orcas, you look them in the eye, you've written several books about mammals, sea mammals. So the reader, irrespective of own attitudes, understands where you come from. At the same time, you're open-minded and you challenge yourself, and you write with great respect, even though it hurts you at the same time. Leading up to this chapter, you write on page 115, I had always insisted to my Faroese friends that this was the line I could never cross. That line is still there, but becoming fainter. But one day when you're in Tórshavn, you get a text from your friend Johannes on Voar, who says that there will be a pilot whale drive in Hvannasund in the Northern Islands. You describe it as a text that you were hoping never to get. You hesitate, but you decide to go. And as you embark on the 1-hour drive to Hvannasund, you write on page 164, I feel as if I'm crossing into a different dimension. Here, my world will change. Once the hunt is over and you travel back to Tórshavn, you write on page 184 that if you had taken part in the killing, and I quote, there would be nothing sacred left in the world, and the 8-year-old boy who cried when he killed a tot would be gone forever. These are some really powerful statements, and my question to you is, did your world change?
Well, it did change, of course, because ever since my first visit to Faroe Islands, I had known about Grindadrap. And I did not take the view that it was wrong or right. I knew that it was a tradition on some levels, and I knew how important whale meat had been historically for people in Faroe Islands. And it was something that I felt I could not write about in the book unless I had seen it firsthand. So I wanted to see it as an observer, but I was nervous on that first occasion that if I was in the middle of a whale drive and I witnessed these rather magnificent creatures that I had spent many years looking for as a diver and being mesmerized with in other parts of the world, if I witnessed them being killed, would I change my attitude to Faroe Islands and to Faroese people? That was my fear. Having seen the process, I still believe it's something that I don't want to do myself. But I'm very careful not to tell people that they are wrong or bad for doing it. Perhaps it's my training as an anthropologist, but I believe that respecting other cultures is absolutely essential if you want to understand them. And I think that keeping dialogue open is about being respectful and asking questions and not telling people that they are bad people for doing certain things in certain ways. As time went on, I saw Grindadrap more than once. I obviously became familiar with the apportioning of the meat, the biology of the animals as they were dissected. And I found the natural history aspect of the pilot whale, of course, very interesting. But I have many times eaten whale meat. I don't have a problem with doing that. And I found that if I explained to Faroese people why I think whales are slightly different to sheep or cattle, they are respectful of my views and they listen to my opinion, and they often say that they now understand my position. I have subsequently been offered the chance to play a more active part in Grindadrap, and it's a decision I've decided not to do that just because it's not essential for me. I've been in the middle of it, I've seen it at close quarters, so in terms of understanding the process and witnessing it, I've done everything I need to do. But yes, it's to do with my own deep personal connection with marine life more, and the fact that marine mammals, I believe, are the same level of intelligence as chimps and apes and perhaps elephants. So I'm a little bit squeamish about taking part in naturally killing.
Yeah, I think I could bury that elephant in the room with the final sentence in the chapter, which very much sums up the respect that you have for our way of preserving. I will just read the sentence. You help Johannes prepare the whale meat, and you write, at times like this, I envy Johannes his practical view of the world and the animals within it. We're here in the Nordic house in Tórshavn, and just across from here is a beautiful island, Nólsoy. I would now like to turn back to our friend Bue to read a short, beautiful passage about Nólsoy, where he in fact also lives with his wife and children. But first, Tim, could you please read the text in English, and then Bue will continue in Faroese.
Nólsoy. I was very lucky during a lot of my research periods in Tórshavn to live in a house looking straight across at Nólsoy, and I visited the island many times. But it's something I wrote after thinking about the island quite a lot. Nólsoy is a gigantic bulwark protecting Tórshavn from the worst of the westerly winds. It could be a sleeping whale, a silhouette of gentle curves, humped and half-submerged, bulbous and tapering. It dozes opposite the town, a fixed point in the endless skittering shadow show of cloud and current. Even from Tórshavn's old fort at Skansin, right at the water's edge, the whole island frequently melts away, erased from the horizon by a magical shroud of mist and rain. But often enough, there are days when Nólsoy glows, lit up by a low sun. Then it hovers, a glowing spaceship between sea and sky. And in the small silent hours, when the moon is full and rising above a tenebrous sea, I have found myself awake and alone, mesmerized by clouds racing above the island, chasing one another away and into the blackness at the edge of the world. It truly seems like a floating thing, like Tír na nÓg and other mythical Atlantic islands.
Thank you.
Nólsoy stender som ein risa stor verjegarer fyrir havnena, mot dem og ringast og landsningsvindenum. Hon kunde være en sovande storkvæler, ein skuggamynd av bleiton boon, kuput og holv i sjånon, bunkut ja. Hon ligger durvande iver av boinon som eit mi ut i enda leisa skuggaleitjenon av streima sjekvi og skudja flokom. Skjolt ur fjørene vi gamla skansan i havn kvørver oyggjum vi kvørst, viska borster ur havsbrunne av huldosligare tåko og regne. Ta no tujum løter ta Nólsoyggjum gleggvar i glæmene fra lokt liggjande solene. Ta sveimar hon. Eit gluande rumdarfær mittlen himmel og hav. Og i taimon kvirro nottartøymenon, ta i månen fotler og ryser iver skugga kjenta heve, hev I stegi allvægjen og einsamadler bergtidjen av fukande skudjum iver ødna, som elta kvart anna inn og i myskre vi heimsins enda. Hon som ein sånn flåti ødj, eins og Tír na nÓg og ganda ødjar i Atlantshaven.
Tack för det. Time is running quickly. I just wanted to ask a final question. The book was published in April during these strange corona pandemic times. So I reckon that the promotion of this book has been quite different from your other ones. But I've seen some good reviews in the UK and US, but how has the reception been? And have you had any reactions from the Faroe Islands?
Well, of course, it was a reaction from the Faroe Islands that I cared about most deeply. As you say, I mention a lot of people in the Faroe Islands in the book, and I was very anxious during the writing process that those people should feel that I had represented them accurately and that I had treated them with respect, because the one thing I would have hated would have been for anyone mentioned in the book or anything about Faroes which I had written to cause distress or discomfort, or for people to make me feel that I had made some grave errors. Of course, as with any book, there are mistakes in it, and I will correct those for the second edition. But yes, critically in the UK, it's been very well received. I've had some very positive reviews. I have not been able to go to as many literary festivals as normal because almost all of them are cancelled. But I did go to a couple in the spring, and it has sold well in this country in spite of the pandemic, because I think in many ways reading about the Faroe Islands represented a big escape for many people. They found the topic interesting, but many people said that they found it a very great antidote to all the negative things that were going on in the world, and to read about somewhere that they knew very little about, and to read particularly a book which immerses them in a natural world, and perhaps a society which represents a lot of truths about the world and a lot of some of the very basic elemental aspects of how we all used to live more in harmony with nature. That struck a chord with a lot of foreign readers. But I've been very touched once again by so many Faroese friends being generous in their congratulations on the book, and telling me that indeed they will still talk to me when I come back to Fyrr the next time. So that was really a very important thing for me. I think it's a great responsibility as a foreigner and utlander to go to anybody else's country and try to portray it in a way which does it justice, but which does it with affection. And I'm not saying that because I'm talking to a Faroese audience. For me, that was probably the thing I worried about most when I was writing about it, that this should be a book that was true to Faroe Islands, that portrayed the islands sympathetically but honestly, and that I should be able to return, and people would not be cross with me in any way, although I know that's not the Faroese way to respond to things generally, but I wanted people in Faroes to feel I had done a reasonable job with the book.
And then I would like to ask, nekker som har spurninger, har anken spurning, så kunne vi alltid få en shot av spurningen. I think people are happy with this, and then I would just say thank you very much for being with us from London. And of course, it's possible to buy the book. Though for those of you who haven't read it, it's available on rithøvundan in the shop and here in the Nordic House and online. You can Google it. So thank you very much for being with us, and we hope to see you soon in the Faroe Islands.
Thank you, Ed. I would just like to add, first of all, my own personal thanks to you and to Bókin for reading so beautifully in Faroese. I still hope one day to return for long enough to learn a bit more Faroese. I try a few more words each time I visit. But I do also want to thank Videosamrøða, because they have done an amazing job of stocking the book and getting it to the Faroe Islands under very difficult conditions. And I appreciate that very, very much. So thank you to everyone at Videosamrøða, and thank you to anyone who's tuned in. And I will say, høyrast and vitsujast.
Takk for det, og ha et godt kveld. Thank you.